What would you do if you discovered a family so isolated, so cut off from the world, that the only laws they followed were the ones they invented themselves? Because in the Oregon mountains, just beyond the reach of town roads and church bells, one such family existed, and the truth buried beneath their floorboards would haunt the region for more than a century. Welcome back to Fear's Litany, where we dive into the most disturbing and forgotten chapters of American history. Before we begin, tell me something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case we uncover. Tonight's story isn't about ghosts, legends, or folklore. It's about a real family who chose isolation over community, secrecy over sanity, and a dynasty over every law of nature. And when the truth finally surfaced, investigators would question not just what happened in that house, but how long it had been happening before anyone dared to look. Let's begin. In a valley where you could scream for miles and no one would ever hear you, one man decided his children would never need the outside world again. By the mid-1880s, the land around Crater Lake was less a community and more a scattering of names on a surveyor's map. A sawmill here, a cabin there, and long stretches of country where winter buried tracks and summer swallowed sound. It was into this distance that a man named Waldo Oats disappeared in 1885, signing his name to roughly 200 acres of timber and stone that no one else had the patience or desperation to claim. The year before, in 1884, his wife had died in childbirth with twins, a boy and a girl, Wilbert and Phoebe. The records are thin. 1 death entry, 2 live birra. There's a note from a frazzled country doctor. But the effect on Waldo is clear in what followed. He did not remarry. He did not move in with relatives. Instead, he bought land further away from anyone who knew him and began cutting his grief into boards. Neighbors later said you could tell which house was his by the way it seemed built more for endurance than comfort. 2 stories, plain lines, a wide porch that faced a dirt track rather than a town road. Attached to it, a sawmill that never truly stopped, its worklight the only constant glow on some winter nights. Waldo felled his own trees, milled his own planks, and raised walls that kept out wind, snow, and nearly everyone else. The twins grew up inside that project. While other children in the county met each other at church socials and harvest gatherings, the Oats children met the shape of their father's back at the saw table, the smell of sap, and the steady thud of wood stacking up against the side of the house. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and visits into town were sparse, focused on supplies rather than conversation. People knew Waldo by the way he paid in full and left before anyone could ask after the children. Yet even in a place that distant, you could not raise a family without being seen at all. As the twins approached school age, Waldo had to bring them in at least once, to register them, to prove they existed beyond his property line. One such trip, sometime around 1895, left a mark deep enough that those who witnessed it remembered it for decades. Phoebe, slight and pale, stepped off the wagon in a borrowed dress that had clearly never been made for her shape. Her brother stood close enough that their shoulders touched. They didn't mingle, didn't run, didn't join the chaotic swirl of other children. They watched. For many children, that would have passed as shyness. For some of the rougher boys and town, it was an invitation. They mocked her quietness, her colorless hair, the way she kept her eyes lowered. Someone tugged at her sleeve. Someone else imitated her silence, turning it into a joke. Waldo saw it from across the street, hands full of flour and salt, and something in him made a final decision. Witnesses recall he didn't shout or strike anyone. He simply set down his purchases, crossed the distance, gathered the twins, and left without another word. There were no more school discussions after that. No church sign-ups, no talk of sending the twins to stay with relatives for a season. Waldo continued to buy supplies, but he came alone. and when asked about the children, he replied in short, closed phrases. "They're fine. They're home." Over time, even those questions stopped. The Oats family became one of those accepted absences on the edge of town, out there, somewhere, behind their own line of trees. From the outside, it looked like a man choosing a quiet life in hard country. But inside that house, on that isolated patch of Oregon timber, a different truth was forming. Isolation wasn't just the setting the twins were born into. It was the first decision ever made for them, and the one that would shape every decision that followed. By the time they turned 18, Phoebe and Wilbert didn't just share a birthday. They shared a world that didn't include anyone else. Their bond began in small, almost unnoticeable ways. As children, they played quietly, rarely arguing, rarely separating for more than a few minutes. When Waldo called one of them, the other followed without question. When one reached for an object, the other's hand moved as if anticipating the motion. At first, it looked like the natural closeness of twins shaped by a remote life. But as the years moved past 1895, their connection sharpened into something far more precise. They spoke less and less around their father. In Ted, they traded short glances, tiny movements of their mouths, almost imperceptible shifts of posture that seemed to carry entire conversations. If Waldo entered a room, the twins fell silent, not out of fear, but because whatever thought had been shared between them was not meant for anyone else. He noticed that questions answered by Phoebe were finished by Wilbert, and responses meant for one twin were acknowledged by both. It was as if they functioned on a single current that he could never tap into. The attic became their chosen territory sometime in their early adolescence. Waldo first assumed they were hiding from the cold or seeking privacy as they grew older. But later he found the door closed, sometimes locked from the inside, and the two of them emerging hours later with dust on their sleeves and expressions he couldn't read. The space was meant for storage, not living, yet they treated it like a second home, entering together, leaving together, always in sync. What drew them there became clear only when Waldo noticed missing stacks from the trunk of books belonging to their grandfather, a man they had never met. The books were a strange mix: genealogical charts, studies on inherited traits, livestock breeding records, even notes on selective pairing from rural agricultural texts. Heavy reading for young teenagers, yet the twins handled them with a level of focus that unsettled their father. Whenever he asked what they were studying, they offered the same rehearsed answer: family things. Winters only strengthened their isolation. Snow covered the roads for months, turning the property into a world of its own. While other families made trips into town when weather permitted, the Oats house remained still. Waldo worked the mill. The twins kept to their patterns. They moved through the home like reflections of one another, mirrored gestures, mirrored steps, roared silences. When one paused mid-sentence, the other completed the thought in perfect alignment. As they grew into adulthood, this unity no longer felt like childhood closeness. It resembled a system with no entry point for anyone else. Waldo tried small efforts to pull them into the wider life beyond the house, asking if they wanted to help at the mill, accompany him on errands, speak with neighbors when rare visitors passed by. Every attempt was met with polite rejection, as if he were interrupting a private world he had never been meant to witness. By 18, the twins no longer behaved like two individuals learning to navigate a shared home. They moved like a closed circuit, self-sustaining and inward-facing. Their conversations happened without words. Their decisions were made without discussion. Their loyalty was directed not toward the man who raised them, but toward each other. And while nothing outwardly alarming had occurred yet, the shift was unmistakable. Their unity was no longer a comfort of childhood. It had become a boundary, one Waldo would soon realize he could not cross. When Waldo finally demanded to know who his daughter was marrying, the answer was a name he'd chosen for both of them at birth. His first sign that something had shifted appeared in winter of 1902, on a night when the house was colder than usual. Waldo passed by the upstairs hallway to close the shutters and noticed the twins' door slightly ajar. Inside, two shapes rested under one quilt. For a moment he assumed it was accidental, a temporary arrangement for warmth, but when he asked them the next morning, their reply came without hesitation. "It's always been that way," Wilbert said. Phoebe nodded, as if confirming a fact long settled. It wasn't true. Waldo knew it wasn't, but the ease with which they agreed, almost in unison, made it clear that pressing them further would lead nowhere. They closed the door after answering, locking it behind them with a soft click that felt too practiced. In the weeks that followed, their habits tightened. They spent nearly all their waking hours in the attic, emerging only when Waldo had gone to the mill or stepped outside. They carried notebooks he had never seen before. They whispered without speaking. Their eyes moved to each other first, him second. Nothing about their routine included him anymore, and for the first time he sensed that he was being managed, kept at a distance, given only the information they wanted him to have. The second sign came unexpectedly. Waldo went into town alone for supplies, as he had for years, and found a merchant greeting him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your young ones came by yesterday," the man said, "buying fabric for a ceremony. Didn't realize the wedding would be so soon." Waldo froze. "What wedding?" The merchant laughed lightly, as if Waldo were joking. "Well, the white cloth. They said it was for a family occasion. I just assumed." Waldo waited for more details, but the merchant seemed uncomfortable, choosing not to elaborate. That discomfort lodged itself in Waldo's mind. A secret trip, a purchase he hadn't approved, a conversation he hadn't been part of, and the phrase that echoed, a ceremony, within the family. He left town with a feeling colder than the wind that chased him home. That night, Waldo sat in the living room waiting. He heard the attic door open, then the slow, synchronized steps of his children descending. They entered the room together, standing shoulder to shoulder as if they had rehearsed their positions. Waldo held the folded receipt from the merchant in his hand, but he didn't need it. Their expressions told him enough. "I was told you bought cloth," he began. "For a ceremony. You didn't ask me. You didn't tell me. So I'm asking now, directly. What's going on?" Phoebe looked to Wilbert. Wilbert looked back to Phoebe. A silent exchange, quick but unmistakably deliberate. Then Wilbert spoke, voice steady. "We've made a decision," he said. "We intend to marry." Waldo felt the air tighten. "Marry who?" This time, Phoebe answered. "Each other." They said it plainly. No shame, no hesitation, no awareness that the words were anything but reasonable. And as they explained their logic in short, polished sentences, pure lineage, family continuity, historical precedent, Waldo realized something deeper than defiance had taken root. Their world no longer had space for anyone else, including him. And now they were ready to seal it. With a few whispered vows and no witnesses but the trees, the Oats twins turned their father's farmhouse into the headquarters of their own dynasty. The ceremony took place in May 1903, on a morning with no particular significance beyond the one the twins assigned to it. Behind the house, near the line where the cleared yard met the first rise of pine, Phoebe and Wilbert stood opposite one another while Waldo watched from a short distance. There was no pastor, no legal document, no ring exchange. Only the twins speaking in steady, almost synchronized voices, reciting vows they had written themselves. Waldo later said he remembered only three things clearly: the closeness of their posture, the way they broke eye contact with no one but each other, and the quiet certainty with which they pronounced themselves joined. What he felt in that moment came and went in one sentence. Then he stepped back, leaving them to finish alone. There were no objections to raise that would change anything. When he returned to the house, the twins were already inside, not celebrating but reorganizing. They moved into the main bedroom without discussion, clearing out his late wife's belongings with a clinical efficiency that made the room unrecognizable within the hour. They sorted drawers, shifted furniture, and claimed the space as if it had always belonged to them. By afternoon, they began making structural changes. Extra locks appeared on doors that had never needed them. Windows on the first floor were partially boarded from the inside, not for weatherproofing but for privacy. They carried tools downstairs and spoke vaguely of preparing the future of the family as they moved between the kitchen and the basement door with measured intent. When Waldo asked what they were doing, they answered with terms he struggled to challenge. They were adults. The land was private. Interference from authorities was rare this far out. They had read the statutes, understood the gaps, and exploited them with unnerving precision. They claimed inheritance rights as next of kin. They insisted that their decisions were lawful as long as they remained within the boundaries of their property. Every explanation came in paired statements, each twin reinforcing the other, creating a logic he couldn't crack. Through all of it, Waldo retreated. He spent longer hours at the sawmill, listening to the machinery because it drowned out the muffled sounds of the twins moving through the house with their new routines. He began drinking in the evenings, not heavily at first, but enough that he could fall asleep without thinking about what he had witnessed. The home he had built with his own hands no longer felt like a place he lived in. It felt like a structure he was trespassing inside. Within days, the transformation was complete. The house no longer operated like a family dwelling. It functioned with rules he hadn't agreed to, doors he didn't open, and spaces where he no longer belonged. The twins walked its hallways with the calm assurance of people establishing territory. By the end of that first week, Waldo realized something unsettling. The farmhouse hadn't simply changed shape. It had changed purpose. The more unusual their children appeared, the more the twins smiled, as if nature's errors were proof that their theory was working. The first pregnancy began less than a year after the ceremony. There was no announcement, no shared excitement, just subtle changes that Waldo observed from a distance. Phoebe moving more slowly up the stairs, Wilbert taking on the heavier physical work without comment, the two of them closing doors more often than before. When he realized what was happening, it was not through conversation, but through the growing number of supplies they ordered and the way they measured time in weeks instead of days. In March 1904, a storm rolled over the property, bringing sudden wind and hard, unbroken rain. That night, the twins barred Waldo from the upstairs hallway. When he tried to approach, Wilbert met him at the base of the stairs with a simple statement: "We have it under control." There was no plea for help, no request for the doctor in town. The sounds that followed, muffled strain, low commands, the creak of boards, were filtered through the closed door of the main bedroom. By morning, the crying of a newborn cut through the house. When Waldo was finally allowed into the room, it was not to hold his grandchild. He saw only a bundled shape briefly before Phoebe pulled the cloth back over the infant's face. What struck him was not the child itself, but the twins' response. They were calm, almost studious. On a small table beside the bed lay a notebook and a strip of measuring tape. Wilbert noted numbers while Phoebe adjusted the baby's position, inspecting hands, head, and limbs with a focus that belonged more in a laboratory than a family home. The child, a girl, was different. Extra fingers, a skull shape that did not match the soft roundness he expected. Waldo's instinct was to look away, to soften his gaze out of courtesy. The twins did the opposite. They leaned in, trading observations in short, efficient phrases and writing them down. They did not discuss a name. They discussed characteristics. In the weeks that followed, that pattern held. The baby was fed, kept warm and attended to, but always with that same detached, analytical care. Waldo heard phrases like, "Record her response," "Note the change," "Observe at waking." When he asked what they called her, Phoebe replied, "She's our first result." The second pregnancy came quickly. By the end of the same year, Phoebe's shape changed again. This time, there was less concealment. The twins moved with a quiet expectation that suggested they were not just expanding a family, but expanding a trial. The notebooks multiplied. The basement door saw more use, though Waldo was never told why. In December 1904, the second child was born, another storm season arrival. Again, Waldo was kept downstairs during the delivery. Again, the newborn's first cry marked the end of the labor and the start of something else. When he eventually saw the baby boy, he recognized nothing outwardly unusual. The child's hands, skull, and features appeared unremarkable. The twins' expressions changed in a different way this time. There was no visible pride, no rush to document. Wilbert made fewer notes. Phoebe held the boy, but her gaze wandered. When Waldo asked, cautiously, if this one had a name, Wilbert answered, "He's a control. We'll see what he offers." The difference in treatment became impossible to ignore. The girl, deformed but reactive, remained the focus of their attention. They carried her more often, monitored her responses, altered her surroundings. The boy was left alone for long stretches, placed in a cradle at the edge of the room, or passed off to Waldo with instructions that sounded more like caretaking for an object than a person. As the months passed, new sounds emerged from parts of the house Waldo rarely entered. At night, he sometimes heard faint crying that didn't match either child he'd seen upstairs. When he asked about it, the twins dismissed it without hesitation. "Wind in the boards," Phoebe said. "The house settling," Wilbert added. The explanations were too smooth, too synchronized. Waldo accepted them outwardly, but something in the rhythm of the home had changed. The twins no longer spoke of children. They spoke of outcomes, comparisons, and patterns. Birth had not softened them. It had sharpened their focus. For the first time, Waldo understood that whatever was happening under his roof was no longer just wrong in principle. It was crossing into something he couldn't name, but could no longer pretend not to hear. When a man who'd faced bullets and ambushes said a farmhouse made his skin crawl, people should have listened. Homer Mixon had spent half his life tracking game through the forests around Crater Lake. He could tell a storm by the way the air shifted, and he could read human intentions almost as easily as he read animal tracks. So when he saw smoke rising from the Oats property at 3 a.m, he didn't shrug it off. He noted the direction, the density, and the hour. Something about it didn't match the usual rhythm of a family house. 2 days later, while checking his trap lines, he made a casual turn toward the Oats home. He told himself it was nothing more than neighborly curiosity, but the truth was simpler. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something on that land felt off balance. Wilbert answered the door with a practiced smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Phoebe stood just behind him, mirroring his posture without consciously trying. Homer noticed that first, a small detail, but precise enough to stick. The twins invited him inside for coffee, polite and welcoming on the surface, though each gesture seemed timed to the other's movements. The kitchen carried a faint medicinal odor, sharp enough to cut through the smell of boiling coffee. Homer didn't comment, but he registered it. He also noticed the windows, partially boarded from the inside, not for wheat, but for privacy. The door to the hallway had a new lock. Under the rug leading toward the basement, the floor showed signs of recent hammering, nail heads too bright, wood too freshly cut. The twins sat across from him at the table, answering questions in short, matched phrases. If Homer asked how they'd been, Phoebe would start a sentence and Wilbert would finish it. If he mentioned the tough winter, they responded in perfect agreement, as if their voices were part of the same breath. To most visitors, it might have seemed like ordinary closeness. To Homer, it registered as rehearsed. Midway through the visit, he asked for the bathroom. They pointed toward the hallway, but something in their exchange, another silent glance, made him take note. He moved quietly, not snooping, but attentive. At the far end of the hall near the basement door, he paused. A sound rose from below, soft at first, then unmistakable. A child crying. Not a storm-board groan, not pipes or wind. A child. Cry. Pause. Cry again. Homer froze, listening just long enough to be certain. Then he returned to the kitchen, careful not to show what he'd heard. "Didn't know you had little ones down there," he said casually, settling back into his seat. The effect was immediate. The twins' smiles vanished, wiped clean in the space of a breath. Phoebe straightened. Wilbert's hands tightened around his cup. Their responses overlapped, rushed and too smooth. "Just the wind," Phoebe said. "The boards shift," Wilbert added. Homer didn't push it. He'd learned long ago that when people hurried to deny something simple, the truth was never far behind. He finished his coffee, thanked them for the hospitality, and left without looking back inside. As he rode away, a cold certainty settled in his stomach. He had seen eccentric families, hard families, private families, but he had never walked into a home where the wall seemed to hide something alive. He couldn't explain it yet, but he knew something in that house wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. Somewhere between the first and third child, the word baby disappeared from the twins' vocabulary, replaced by something far colder. Phoebe's third pregnancy in early 1905 unfolded with a level of secrecy that surpassed anything Waldo had seen before. The twins no longer hid their intentions, they simply shut him out of them. Their days followed a strict pattern. Long stretches spent behind closed doors, hushed exchanges at the top of the stairs, and trips to the basement at hours when the rest of the house slept. The few times Waldo asked what they were preparing, they gave the same answer in synchronized tone. "We're refining the process." He had no idea what that meant, but the certainty behind the phrase stayed with him. As the months progressed, the twins' movements grew more deliberate. They carried notebooks, glass jars, cloth bundles, and small instruments Waldo didn't recognize. They spoke less and wrote more. Their steps to and from the basement quickened as Phoebe's pregnancy advanced, as if they were racing an invisible clock. What unsettled Waldo most was not the secrecy itself, but the sense that each task they performed had been planned long before the child was conceived. The birth came in the heat of summer. No storm this time, only the thick stillness of an afternoon that felt unnaturally quiet. The twins barred Waldo from the upstairs hallway again, but he didn't try to approach. It was clear that whatever happened behind that door was no longer within his reach. The labor lasted hours. He heard low commands, the scrape of furniture, and Phoebe's strained breathing, but nothing prepared him for the sound that followed. A thin, struggling cry, weak enough that he wasn't sure if it belonged to a newborn or something fading. When Wilbert finally opened the bedroom door, he didn't invite Waldo in. He simply stated, "She made it. We'll take it from here," Adisha says before closing the door again. The glimpse Waldo managed came later when they moved the child downstairs. The girl's deformities were more pronounced than the firstborn's. Her chest rose unevenly. Her hands curled inward. Her breathing came in short, uneven bursts. The twins did not react with fear or grief. Their focus narrowed to measurements, length of limbs, cranial shape, reflex responses, each recorded in neat columns inside their notebooks. They did not call her by name. Instead, Wilbert referred to her as the improved one, while the firstborn girl was the special one. The second child, healthy but ignored, had been reduced to the failure. The terms were spoken without hesitation, as if they were categories rather than living children. In the days that followed, Waldo noticed a shift in the rhythms of the house. The twins spent hours downstairs, the basement door opening and closing with a consistency that suggested a full schedule. They carried food, but little else. When Waldo passed near the door, he sometimes caught faint cries, different tones, different patterns, not just one child, but more. The sounds didn't align with the 3 grandchildren he had seen or heard upstairs. One night, while he was closing the shutters, he paused. A soft whimper drifted upward from the floorboards beneath his feet. Another followed, higher in pitch. Then a third, short, sharp, and unlike the others. The sequence was unmistakable. These were not echoes of the same voice. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wood. The cries weren't overlapping but layered, separate breaths, separate throats, separate children, far more than he had ever been shown. Waldo stood slowly, dread spreading through him in a way he hadn't felt before. He counted the cries, counted again, and realized the truth. There were more children in this house than the 3 the twins had acknowledged. And each one was hidden behind doors he was no longer allowed to open. He finally saw the truth through a pane of dusty glass. And that was the last anyone ever saw of him. Homer Mixon returned to the Oats property in late 1905 with none of the social courtesy of his first visit. He moved at dawn when the forest was still grey and the ground carried the cold from the night before. He didn't approach by the road. He slipped through the tree line instead, the way a man does when he intends to see something without being seen. He studied the house from a distance first. No smoke from the chimney. No movement at the windows. The boarded sections he had noticed earlier had multiplied. Some were reinforced with nails driven in at angles, as though meant to keep something in rather than keep weather out. Homer waited, patient and silent, watching for any sign of the twins. When none came, he circled behind the house, keeping to the shadows until he reached the lowest windows, half buried, half covered in a way that suggested someone had tried to hide them rather than protect them. He wiped the dust from one corner and looked inside. The basement was not a storage space anymore. It had been divided into narrow sections, each enclosed by makeshift partitions reinforced with planks and scrap metal. The light inside came from a lantern hanging near the stairs, its dim glow barely reaching the far corners. But Homer saw enough. Small compartments, each one containing bedding arranged in thin, flattened shapes. Bowls, cloths, a series of notches carved into one wall that looked like someone had counted days. Then he saw movement. Wilbert descended the stairs with a bucket of water, set it beside one of the partitions, and slid it through a low opening. For a moment, Homer thought he saw a hand reach out, small, slow, unsteady. Wilbert said nothing. He moved to the next partition, carrying a tin bowl, repeating the same action with mechanical precision. Moments later, Phoebe appeared behind him with a folded cloth and a jar of something that glinted piles in the lantern light. They didn't speak. They worked in a rhythm, tending to each section as if checking stations in a controlled setup. Homer realized then that these weren't storage spaces at all. They were cells. He shifted his angle slightly, focusing deeper into the room. In another section, a child sat curled against the wall, knees pulled up, eyes unfocused, not screaming, not reaching, just existing in a way that made Homer's stomach tighten. A second child lay on a thin mattress, breathing but barely moving. A third shape stirred in the far corner, only visible by the faint rise and fall of its shoulder. Nothing about what he saw resembled caregiving. It resembled containment. Homer pulled back from the window instinctively, heart steady but heavy. He had seen enough to understand what Waldo might have been too broken or too afraid to confront. He didn't stay long. He turned toward the tree line, planning to return to town by a route that kept him far from the house. But Homer Mixon never reached town. By midday, when he hadn't returned to camp, a search began. His footprints at the forest's edge were found easily. His rifle was discovered not far from the Oats property, leaned against a tree as if placed deliberately. But there were no signs of a struggle, no trail leading away, no indication of where he'd gone after stepping out of the trees. The twins joined the search with convincing concern, answering every question with calm, practiced sincerity. They offered coffee, recounted their morning, and kept their expressions steady. To the sheriff, Nothing seemed immediately amiss. But to the locals, word of Homer's last known direction spread quickly. A man who read terrain better than most men read newspapers did not simply vanish on familiar land. He had seen something he was never meant to see, and whatever waited beneath the Oats house ensured he would no ever speak of it again. By 1907, the Oats property had more children than names, and more screams than anyone was willing to investigate. The fourth child arrived in the spring of 1906. The pregnancy had been quieter than the one before it, marked less by secrecy and more by tightened routines. When the birth finally came, Waldo was again kept downstairs, listening to the same pattern of muted movements he'd grown used to. When he eventually glimpsed the boy, it was without ceremony. The infant looked physically normal, steady breathing, clear eyes, and limbs that moved without strain. But after the first day, it became clear that something was missing. He didn't cry. He didn't track movement. He stared at nothing with an unsettling stillness that made even Wilbert pause before labeling him. "Another control," Wilbert murmured, as he recorded the child's responses. Phoebe nodded, already preparing another page in their notebook. That summer revealed the pattern growing inside the house. The girl, born in 1904, remained their main focus. The second boy, labeled a failure, received barely any notice. The newborn was observed but not nurtured, checked for reactions in strict intervals, then returned to a cradle with an indifference that left Waldo uneasy. He began hearing the children at night, their cries rising and falling in irregular rhythms. Sometimes one voice, sometimes several overlapping. None of the sounds matched the three children he had been shown. The fifth pregnancy became evident in late 1906. This time, the twins didn't bother explaining anything to Waldo. They simply shifted their routines, increasing their basement visits and locking doors earlier in the day. Waldo's health declined under the pressure. He slept poorly, waking from dreams of distant wailing that didn't fade with morning. His hands shook. He lost weight. His eyes carried the look of someone who had stopped trusting the very walls around him. When the fifth child was born in the spring of 1907, the twins handled the labor entirely on their own. Waldo knew a baby had arrived only because he heard short, strained breaths coming from behind the bedroom door. The child, a girl, seemed to struggle from the start. She breathed in quick, pained bursts. Her limbs were twisted at angles that didn't seem natural. The twins observed her without hesitation, treating every labored breath as data. In the following months, the noise inside the house grew louder, more varied. It didn't sound like 2 or 3 children anymore. There were high-pitched cries, deeper whimpers, weak mewling sounds, and sharp bursts of distress. Waldo couldn't identify the sources. The twins never acknowledged them. The region around the Oats property started noticing too. Lumberjacks passing through the nearby ridge claimed they heard what sounded like several children crying from deep within the trees. A shepherd vanished for a day and returned shaken, muttering about voices under the floorboards of the Oats house, something he refused to explain in detail. A traveling merchant, stopping briefly to trade, later reported seeing Wilbert at night, carrying a bundle that moved under its sheets. When the merchant greeted him, Wilbert walked faster, disappearing behind the house. Inside, the twins intensified their control. Waldo found himself intercepted whenever he walked too close to the basement door. The hallway near the stairs became a monitored zone, with Phoebe or Wilbert appearing almost instantly whenever he lingered. Rooms he once entered freely became off-limits. He began to understand that certain parts of the house no longer belonged to him, or perhaps never had. By late 1907, the official count of Oats children stood at 3. But the voices echoing through the floorboards told a different story, one Waldo no longer had the strength or the courage to ignore, and one the surrounding community was only beginning to suspect. When a country doctor realizes the numbers on his birth ledger don't match the babies he's seen, that kind of discrepancy doesn't go away on its own. Dr. Clarence Benson didn't start with suspicion. He started with paperwork. In the months after Homer Mixon's disappearance, Benson had been asked more than once if the hunter had shown any signs of illness or confusion. He hadn't. Homer's last visit to the surgery had been routine. Still, the questions nudged Benson toward reviewing his notes, not on Homer, but on the families orbiting that same patch of country. The Oats name appeared only a few times: a twin birth in 1884, a death in childbirth, and a pair of notations from the last few years about difficult deliveries at the Oats property, with no follow-up. He turned to his birth ledger. One Oats entry in 1904, another near the year's end, 2 children documented, yet in conversation at the general store and in half-formed comments from townsfolk, he'd heard reference to the new baby more than twice. When he recalculated, counting known pregnancies against recorded births, the arithmetic broke. There were more pregnancies than listed children. Benson did not build theories on gossip. He built them on patterns. So he requested access to the county registry, citing a desire to update medical records. The clerk pulled the volumes. There they were again, the same 2 Oats children formally registered. Nothing more. No notations about stillbirths, deaths in infancy, or burial permits. Either the missing children had never existed, or they existed in a way no one had acknowledged. The next piece arrived by chance. A shipment list from a regional supplier, left on a counter in the post office, caught his eye one afternoon. Among orders for tools and household goods, he saw an entry under the Oats account, several medical and scientific titles, delivered over the past 2 years. Heredity in domestic animals. Structural anomalies in mammalian development. Introductory human anatomy for practitioners. It was an unusual election for a sawmill family. Benson made discreet inquiries. The postmaster confirmed that Wilbert and Phoebe collected the packages together, signing with crisp, practiced signatures. They did not linger. They did not explain. They walked back toward the hills with books that belonged more in a lecture hall than in a remote farmhouse. The doctor assembled the pieces in his head. Undeclared children, multiple difficult pregnancies, no infant burials recorded, orders for texts on deformities and development, a missing hunter whose last known path led in that direction. Taken separately, they could be dismissed. Taken together, they formed something he could no longer classify as shyness or shame. Meanwhile, reports about the Oats patriarch changed in tone. Waldo, once described as distant but functional, was increasingly spoken of in the past tense. He doesn't come to town much now. The children handle things. When Benson questioned those who had seen him, they described a man thinner, quieter, hovering at the edge of his own porch while the twins handled conversation. More than one person remarked, "He looks like a visitor at his own place." Inside that house, authority had shifted. Whatever decisions were being made no longer ran through Waldo. By late 1907, Benson heard a final detail that settled the matter. A storekeeper mentioned offhand that Phoebe appeared to be expecting again, though no one had formally called for medical assistance. Another pregnancy. No record of where the last children had gone, no graves, no explanations. For a time, Benson tried to convince himself that what he suspected was unreasonable. Then he looked again at the ledger, the registry, the order lists, and the gaps where names should have been. He closed the book, put his pen down, and made a quiet decision. The next time he dealt with the Oats family, it would not be through hearsay, or numbers on a page. He would go to their house himself. The forest around the Oats house had claimed a hunter. When it swallowed a doctor next, the governor's office finally started paying attention. Dr. Clarence Benson approached his investigation the way he approached a difficult diagnosis, step by step, nothing assumed, nothing dismissed. After reviewing his records and gathering enough inconsistencies to trouble any reasonable mind, he made his first quiet move in late 1908. Rather than march up to the Oats property unprepared, he chose to observe from the cover of the tree line, close enough to see patterns, far enough to avoid being noticed. What he saw over the next months hardened his suspicions into certainty. At night, the twins moved with rigid consistency. Shortly after dusk, Wilbert carried food buckets down the back steps toward the basement door, always checking over his shoulder before unlocking it. A few hours later, Phoebe emerged with cloth bundles, waste from the way she handled them, and walked them deep into the woods to bury beneath disturbed soil. The process repeated itself nightly, like an unspoken schedule neither deviated from. Sometimes Benson heard faint cries drift through the still air, the kind that didn't belong to the documented children he knew about. Once, he heard several at once, varying in pitch and distance. He noted the times in a pocket ledger, creating a new column labeled Night Vocalizations. It was the closest he came to acknowledging his growing fear. In early 1909, he noticed Phoebe moving differently, slower, guarded, careful with her hands on the rail of the back porch. By spring, the new pregnancy was impossible to miss, though no one in town had been asked to assist. The sixth child's arrival was never announced, but Benson knew exactly when it happened. The night the twins made twice as many basement trips, carrying blankets and water, and the cries that followed were sharp and new. Waldo never appeared during these routines. The one time Benson spotted him, the man stood motionless on the porch, staring into nothing, as if he no longer recognized the land he lived on. When the twins noticed his presence, they ushered him inside without a word. By 1910, stories filtered through the community. A pastor traveling the ridge took a sudden detour, claiming he felt an unease not meant for a man of faith. Loggers mentioned strange lights moving in the trees near the Oats property, small, controlled flashes, not lantern glow. A woman gathering herbs reported hearing muffled screams carried on a windless night. No one could prove anything, but everyone agreed on one point. Something wasn't right up there. Still, Benson waited. He wanted facts, not superstition. In late 1912, confident he had seen enough to warrant intervention, he decided on a formal visit. He told the sheriff he needed to perform a medical welfare check on the Oats family. It was a routine phrase he had used countless times before. But on this occasion, the words carried a weight that neither man understood fully. On the morning of December 3rd, Benson set out in his carriage, bringing a small medical bag, a logbook of his observations, and enough resolve to confront whatever he found. He never arrived. By noon, his horses were discovered 2 miles from the Oats property, pacing nervously near the edge of a ravine. The carriage sat crooked, wheel lodged between roots. Benson's medical bag had spilled open across the ground, scalpel case, stethoscope, and papers scattered in a way that suggested not a fall, but a sudden interruption. There was no sign of the doctor. When search parties reached the Oats house, the twins greeted them with calm politeness, expressing concern and offering to join the search. They answered questions with steady voices, even volunteered to check nearby creeks. This level of cooperation struck more than one man as unsettling, too smooth, too controlled, though no one voiced it aloud. The search lasted days. Trails led nowhere. No footprints, no clothing scraps, no tracks beyond the ones left by the frightened horses. By the end of that winter, one fact settled into local memory like a bruise. The same stretch of forest that had taken Homer Mixon had now swallowed a doctor. And whatever waited on the Oats property was no longer something the town could ignore. Tucker had come looking for bodies. He wasn't prepared to find children still alive inside a house built like a prison. Sheriff Schuyler Tucker had avoided the Oats property for years, citing distance, weather, and lack of direct evidence. But by early 1913, 2 disappearances weighed directly on his office, and the governor's letters arrived weekly. With public pressure mounting, Tucker finally requested a search warrant and secured it. On the morning of March 15th, he rode out with 2 deputies and a county representative, each man uneasy but determined. They moved uphill through a dense fog that made the land feel smaller, compressed, as if the forest itself wanted them gone. The closer they came, the quieter everything grew. Horses slowed without command. Not a single bird sounded in the trees. Even the usual creak of branches in the wind was absent. Tucker noted the silence, but didn't voice it. They reached the Oats clearing at mid-morning. Phoebe and Wilbert stood on the porch waiting for them. At 29, the twins looked strangely unchanged from how Tucker remembered them as teenagers, pale, focused, and moving with eerie coordination. They did not ask why the sheriff had come. They did not express surprise at the papers in his hand. They simply stepped aside, as if the moment had been expected. Inside the house, the air felt close. Doors were reinforced with planks driven in from both sides. Windows had been sealed shut with layers of boards and metal sheeting. Locks appeared in plet. Says where locks didn't belong. Hallways, bedroom thresholds, the pantry door. Tucker moved slowly, checking each latch, noting the consistency of the modifications. Nothing about the structure suggested a family home. It was closer to a containment facility. Upstairs, they found the first wall covered in diagrams. Human silhouettes drawn with meticulous care, annotated with measurements, dates, and ratios Tucker didn't understand. Beside them were crude genealogical charts, lines looping back into themselves, connecting names and birth years with arrows that doubled and crossed. The deputies exchanged glances, but said nothing. Tucker wrote down the details in his notebook, keeping the investigation moving. Further down the hall, more notes lined the walls. Pages tacked in straight rows listed numbers assigned to subjects, each one matched with observations. Limb development, reflex delay, dietary responses. No names appeared anywhere. The deputies' breathing grew louder as they walked. At the end of the hallway, a door stood fastened with two heavy locks. Tucker called for the twins to open it. They didn't argue, but the way they watched him, calm, unblinking, made his hand tighten around his revolver. Wilbert unlocked the door without hesitation and stepped back. The smell reached them first, stale, unwashed air. Tucker pushed the door inward. A small girl, 9 by the approximate size, sat crouched in the far corner. Her limbs were twisted, her back arched in a way that suggested years of confinement. She wore a stained dress that clung to her skin. When the deputies approached, she didn't speak. Instead, she released a series of sharp, animalistic sounds, retreating further into the corner, shielding her face with her arms. Her hair hung in tangled ropes around her shoulders. Tucker noted her visible malnourishment, prominent ribs, shaking limbs, and a pallor that calmed me from years without sunlight. Behind her on the wall, marks tracked height, 11 lines, 11 years. The arithmetic hit Tucker immediately, older than any officially recorded Oats child. The deputies froze. No one spoke. The girl's screams filled the narrow hall, raw and instinctive, the sound of a child who had been taught to fear footsteps. Tucker didn't raise his voice or announce conclusions. He simply stepped back, nodded once to his deputies, and wrote a single line in his notebook. First living child recovered. The search had only begun. In a handful of cramped rooms beneath the floor, Tucker found proof that the Oats twins hadn't been raising a family. They'd been running an experiment. The basement door was reinforced like the rest of the house. 2 locks, 1 new bolt, and hinges that had been replaced more than once. Tucker ordered it opened. Wilbert complied, retrieving the keys without argument. As the door swung inward, a column of cooler air rose from below, carrying a mix of damp, straw, and something older that made the deputies hesitate on the first step. Tucker went down anyway. The staircase was narrow, just wide enough for one man at a time. At the bottom, the basement opened into a corridor lined with doors on both sides. Each door was solidly built, strengthened with extra planks and metal strips. At eye level on every one, a narrow slot had been cut, too small for a head, just large enough for a hand, a bowl, or a small plate. Separate quarters, Wilbert said from behind him. The words were offered as explanation, not apology. Tucker chose the first door on the left and signaled for it to be opened. The interior was small, barely larger than a closet. Straw covered the floor in a thin, flattened layer. The walls, otherwise bare, carried shallow scratch marks from hand height down to the baseboard. No occupant remained. The straw showed the outline of where someone had once lain regularly. In one corner, a length of frayed rope was still anchored to a bolt, its end worn and darkened from repeated use. "How long was this room in use?" Tucker asked. Phoebe answered, 11 years, intermittently. The subject showed early instability. She spoke as if reciting from a chart. The second door opened onto a boy of about 8. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, legs straight out, hands moving in slow, repetitive motions, tapping his fingers together, then pulling at a loose thread in his trouser leg, then starting again. His eyes did not follow the light that spilled into the room. He did not react when the deputies stepped inside. Only when Tucker called his name, a name he did not have, did the boy pause, glance upward once, then return to his rhythm. Physically sound, Wilbert observed, as if they were in a clinic. Limited cognitive response, good for comparison baselines. Tucker wrote down, male, approximately 8, physically developed, severe developmental impairment, no name given. The next door on the right opened to a girl around 7, crouched in the farthest corner of her cell. She flinched when the latch turned, pulling her knees tight to her chest. Her arms bore clear rope marks, rings of damaged skin at both wrists, some old, some recent. She watched the men with sharp, rapid eyes, tracking each movement. When a deputy stepped closer, she retreated as far as the wall would allow. A small sound caught in her throat, but never fully released. "Resistant," Phoebe said, "requires restraint to prevent self-injury and interference with adjacent subjects." The words fell into the room like labels on a specimen jar. Tucker noted the girl's extreme thinness, the way her clothing hung from her frame, the state of the straw under her feet. There were no toys, no blankets, no personal items. Only a tin cup and a dented bowl stacked neatly near the door. The third cell they opened was empty, but the signs of recent occupation were the strongest here. The straw was heavily matted, stained in several places. A length of rope lay coiled loosely, one end still tied to an iron ring in the wall. The smell in this cell was sharper, dense enough that one deputy reflexively covered his mouth. On the wall, above the level of a child's reach, rows of tally marks marched upward in uneven columns, cut into the plaster until some lines broke through to the underlying material. "Subject expired," Wilbert said simply. "Complications. The records are upstairs." Tucker didn't ask for details. The evidence was already written into the room. At the final door, the air was colder. When it opened, the lantern light fell on a small form curled tightly against the far wall, as if trying to occupy as little space as possible. The body had been there long enough for flesh to give way, but not so long that its outline was unrecognizable. What drew Tucker's eye were the hands. The nails were broken down to the quick, fingers outstretched toward the wall, where deep, frantic gouges furrowed the surface. "Not all specimens survive," Phoebe said, breaking the silence. "Death is part of observation. We documented everything." There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, only the calm conviction of someone who believed the explanation was sufficient. Tucker stepped back into the corridor and looked down the line of doors, occupied cells, empty cells, and at least one that had become a tomb. He didn't need to see more. The notes upstairs, the diagrams on the walls, the girl in the bedroom, the boy staring at nothing, the child's remains in the final room, they all formed a single, undeniable conclusion. The Oats property was not a failed household or an unfortunate case of neglect. It was a constructed system, designed and maintained for one purpose, and he had just walked through its core. Even with chains on their wrists and a jury staring them down, the Oats twins insisted they hadn't committed crimes. They'd advanced knowledge. The extraction of the surviving children began the morning after the basement search. Tucker called for medical wagons, and the first examinations took place inside the house itself. The eldest girl, around 9, could barely stand. Her legs buckled under her own weight, and her spine curved sharply from years of confinement. The 8-year-old boy responded only to simple sounds, following a doctor's finger with slow, unfocused movements. 2 younger children, both under 6, showed infections, untreated wounds, and behaviors more consistent with wild animals than with anything resembling raised children. At a double hand clap from a deputy, all 4 reflexively curled into protective positions, a conditioned response that made the physicians trade grim looks. By nightfall, the children were transported to the county infirmary. Reports filed in the following days described stunted bodies, development arrested at early stages, and minds shaped entirely by captivity. The physicians avoided speculation, but their notes were blunt. None of the children would ever fully recover. Phoebe and Wilbert were arrested without resistance. During questioning, neither displayed remorse or confusion. Instead, they spoke calmly about heredity, controlled environments, and isolated variables. Phoebe claimed the children represented proof of concept. Wilbert argued that family lines required purification. Both insisted that their actions were deliberate, structured, and, in their words, scientifically justified. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities recovered notebooks, diagrams, and letters, some addressed to distant institutions, inquiring about developmental anomalies. Measurements filled ledgers, daily logs documented responses to confinement and subject adaptability. The basement's design was clearly premeditated: reinforced doors, systematic feeding, and compartment divisions calibrated for observation. The trial began in late 1913, drawing crowds from across the region. The prosecution laid out a timeline of intentional cruelty: concealed births, forced isolation, medical neglect, and the deaths of multiple children whose remains were discovered in the basement cells. Witnesses testified to the disappearances of Homer Mixon and Dr. Benson, though the twins denied involvement. The defense attempted to argue that Phoebe and Wilbert were insane, victims of isolation and genetic instability. But the prosecution countered with their crisp records, organized charts, and articulate explanations. There was no confusion in their speech, no delusions, only rational, systematic intent. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. Both twins were found guilty of multiple counts: murder, aggravated child abuse, unlawful confinement, and medical malpractice without license. They received life sentences without parole. Waldo was not in the courtroom. Found days earlier in the Oats attic, he had lost all connection to reality, emaciated, incoherent, and unable to recognize his own name. He was sent to a state asylum, where he died in 1918, his mind eroded long before his body followed. The surviving children remained in institutions for the rest of their lives. The eldest girl died young, complications from prolonged malnutrition. The 8-year-old boy lived into his 20s, but never advanced beyond toddler-level cognition. The 2 younger children survived only a few more years, both succumbing to infections their bodies could not fight. In 1920, the Oats house burned. Some said lightning struck the roof during a storm. Others whispered that a former deputy set the match. No official cause was recorded. What remained was a blackened foundation and a sentiment shared quietly by the locals. Whatever had lived in that house, the land no longer wanted it. Phoebe died in prison in 1934, still insisting she was right. Wilbert lasted until 1951, unrepentant to the end. With his death, the Oats dynasty ended, not with a final experiment, but with the collapse of the institution they had tried to build in the dark. Long after the fires ate the Oats house, people said the forest still remembered what had happened there, and that some nights it tried to tell anyone who would listen. In the decades following Wilbert Oats' death in 1951, The story never truly faded. The land where the house once stood became a place locals warned their children about. Hunters who knew every ridge around Crater Lake avoided that stretch entirely, claiming that animals veered away from it before dawn, as if driven by instinct rather than caution. The tree line around the clearing grew warped over the years, trunks bending at unnatural angles, branches clustering toward the ground instead of the sky. People didn't agree on what caused it, but few were willing to step close enough to form their own conclusions. The stories grew in the absence of answers. Some described hearing faint moans drifting across windless nights. Others claimed they'd heard scratching from beneath the earth, always in short bursts, never continuous. A handful of travelers swore they heard the unmistakable cry of a child when no one else was around. Most chalked it up to imagination, yet no one volunteered to camp there to prove it wrong. The land carried its own warning, quiet but unmistaked. Over time, the Oats twins slipped into regional legend, not as monsters, but as the ultimate cautionary tale about what isolation can produce when left unchallenged. They were ordinary people who convinced themselves their cruelty was purposeful. Their records revealed no rage, no passion, no sudden breaking point, only steady, methodical decisions justified by charts, measurements, and theories they believed were above moral scrutiny. Their dynasty never sought followers, but their story became a reminder of how unchecked secrecy can create its own form of madness. Today, the case survives in fragments. Archived ledgers, court transcripts, the memories of old residents, and the brittle newspaper clippings stored in county basements. Historians still mention the missing ledger entries, the unregistered births, and the attempts by state officials to understand how such an operation thrived in plain sight. Researchers point to the Oats family as an example of what happens when communities assume private family matters should stay private, even when signs suggest otherwise. Across rural America, abandoned homesteads and forgotten clearings mirror the same warning. The lesson of the Oats dynasty isn't simply about what happened in that basement. It's about how many other remote places may hold histories people were too frightened or too polite to confront. How many families lived beyond oversight? How many stories were buried before anyone dared to look? And as always, thank you for watching our deep dive into another forgotten chapter of American darkness. Before you go, let me know in the comments. What remote place, abandoned home, or isolated stretch of land near you has a story people don't talk about? Your suggestions help us uncover the next hidden history. If you found this episode compelling, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark, investigative history. Some stories die with the people who created them. Others, like the dynasty that never should have existed, continue to echo long after the house is gone.